I was deployed to the Arctic Radar Station in late December 1983, under orders that were intentionally vague. Our mission dossier labeled it as a routine maintenance and observation operation, but the tone in the intelligence briefing stints, clipped and punctuated by long silences, hinted at a deeper concern. The station, known unofficially as Polar Watch 7, sat on a ridge of permafrost, a dozen miles inland from the last mapped outpost. The winds there do not whisper, scrape, gnaw, and wail, carrying a metallic tang that clung to our masks and lungs. From the moment we landed, the station felt how wrong. Its radar dishes spun silently against the aurora-lit sky, yet the instruments reported anomalies no one could reconcile. Arcoms picked up a low hum, rhythmic, almost like a pulse knot machinery, not wind. The aurora overhead seemed to bend subtly, brushing the horizon in impossible angles, reflections that shifted depending on the observer's position. We joked half-seriously about hallucinations, but that humor vanished quickly in the darkness that descended before any human hour could register. I remember the first night clearly. The generator hissed like it had a throat. Shadows cast by our lamps stretched beyond logic. The walls, prefabricated steel, sometimes seemed to bend inward, as if inhaling. My team, handpicked for technical expertise and resilience, reported similar sensations. Private Jansen swore he saw footprints appear on a floor that had just been scrubbed. Specialist Harrow muttered about whispers echoing in languages that shouldn't exist, calling their names before fading into the static of the coms. At first, we rationalized fatigue, isolation, high latitude, optical illusions. But the unease was cumulative, an invisible weight pressing against the chest with each hour. By the third day, the station was no longer just a facility. It was a prism reflecting and bending reality. Time did not behave consistently. Some moments stretched, others snapped past, leaving us dizzy, disoriented, aware of something watching, but careful to remain unseen. I'm writing this now, knowing that much of it will be suppressed, altered, or dismissed. My testimony is a fragment, a confession against the silence imposed by those who control what is remembered. What we detected in the Arctic was not a threat in the conventional sense. It was patient, it was indifferent, and it was waiting. The Arctic Radar Station was officially tasked with monitoring potential Soviet air incursions, tracking missile tests, and providing early warning for any transpolar strategic activity. However, intelligence reports indicated unusual electromagnetic readings and repeated radar blips that did not correspond with known aircraft or satellites. These anomalies were dismissed in prior briefings as atmospheric disturbances, polar mirages, or sensor errors, but internal memos suggested a far more troubling pattern. Signals appearing and disappearing in ways that defied conventional physics, sometimes mimicking aircraft profiles, but moving at impossible velocities. Our mission was simple on paper: arrive, calibrate the sensors, verify the anomaly logs, and report. In practice, it was a tightrope walk between observation and containment. The Arctic is unforgiving. The margin for error is measured in minutes. Temperatures hovered near 48 degrees Celsius, wind chills could strip flesh, and oxygen levels in the station were artificially stabilized to prevent hypoxia. Every step outside required a full EVA suit, helmet comes checked twice per hour, and constant verification of life support systems. The stakes extended beyond survival. The anomalies hinted at a breach in what our higher command called the normal envelope of reality. If these readings were accurate, and we failed to document them precisely, the consequences were not just geopolitical, they were ontological. Unknown forces could compromise equipment, distort time and perception, or influence cognition. The command made it clear: the anomalies were not for public record. Any failure to secure data were worse. To misinterpret, it would be treated as gross negligence. We were briefed that our presence was as much about observation as it was about containment. Standard operating procedure could not account for entities or phenomena beyond scientific understanding. Each of us was instructed: record everything, report anomalies, maintain operational discipline. Failure was unacceptable. Ignorance was dangerous. Curiosity could be lethal. Even then, none of us truly comprehended what beyond scientific understanding meant until we arrived. Our unit was a 6-member team, each selected for specific skill sets and psychological resilience under extreme conditions. Officially, our roles were straightforward: Unofficially, each carried their own vulnerabilities that the Arctic would expose. Commander Elias Corvan, myself, rational, hardened by years in polar operations and covert surveillance. My responsibility was cohesion and operational control. Though I would soon find that discipline was only partially effective against what awaited, I relied on precise data, clear commands, and redundant checks. But even I began noticing discrepancies in readings that no sensor could justify. Lieutenant mrballen, communications specialist, analytical and meticulous. With experience in encrypted transmissions and alien signal protocols, calm under stress. Yet the first anomaly affected her differently. Signals she processed would return distorted, sometimes containing fragments of voices we did not recognize. Began murmuring to the radio as if it spoke back names, places, phrases that none of us understood. Sergeant Anton Jansen, scout, recon, young, agile, and persistent, with an uncanny ability to read terrain. Private Jansen had a habit of whistling to himself on long patrols, a coping mechanism. The Arctic ridges played tricks on him, footprints appearing where none existed, shadows that moved independently. His humor disappeared by the second night, replaced by muttered warnings about being followed by the cold itself. Specialist Harrow, demolitions engineering, reckless, precise, technically brilliant. Harrow could disarm a complex detonation in seconds, yet his familiarity with explosives did not prepare him for what he would face here. The early anomalies in structural readings unnerved him, though he masked it with dark humor and mechanical tinkering. Corporal Lev Markov, medic, biochemist.com/scientific, deeply observant. Lev's initial focus was physiological, oxygen levels, frostbite risk, cognitive fatigue, but he soon encountered phenomena that eluded biology. He would note anomalies in heart rates and respiration that suggested temporal distortions or energy fields impossible. Readings that no medical manual accounted for. Sergeant Major Thorne, veteran survival expert, steadfast, experienced in Arctic operations and high-stress combat zones. His memory was a repository of survival tactics, but by the third day, he reported gaps in time and flashes of memory that could not have occurred. His bravery never faltered, yet a quiet fear began to shape his judgments. Individually, each of us had faced extreme conditions. Together, we formed a unit capable of handling logistical challenges, hostile weather, and strategic reconnaissance. Yet none were prepared for the subtle and creeping dread that arose from shadows and sensors alike. Small inconsistencies, lights flickering against natural laws, hums of unknown frequency, became personal, intimate. Each anomaly seemed tailored, probing weaknesses, adjusting perception, reminding us that training and rank were meaningless against the unquantifiable. By the time we departed the base for the first insertion, each team member carried more than gear. We carried the growing, unspoken suspicion that Polar Watch 7 was alive in a way no human technology should allow. The mission briefing occurred in the hangar bay of Forward Arctic Command, a facility buried beneath 70 meters of ice and reinforced concrete. A holographic map projected over the table displayed Polar Watch 7, marked with coded sectors for sensor arrays, communication relays, and perimeter patrol routes. Every detail was quantified: temperature gradients, wind shear predictions, oxygen distribution, and equipment redundancies, everything but the anomalies. Colonel Ristov, our supervising officer, addressed us with clipped precision. Your primary objective: calibrate the radar arrays, verify anomaly logs, and maintain observation. Secondary: collect environmental and temporal data. Tertiary: survival: do not engage unless explicitly ordered. Report every anomaly, no matter how minor. The Arctic is unforgiving. Complacency will get you killed faster than frostbite. The briefing left no room for ambiguity, yet an underlying tension lingered. We were shown logs of previous anomalies, blips that vanished mid-track, signals that repeated in nonlinear sequences, and radar reflections that hinted at impossible topographies. Some of the data sets were redacted, marked, classified, sensitive, accompanied by cautionary footnotes warning of sensor contamination or unknown temporal distortion. The implication was clear: previous teams had not survived intact, and records had been sanitized. Deployment began at 0600 hours under perpetual twilight. Our insertion transport, a reinforced Aurora 7 hovercraft, cut through the blizzard with precise mechanical hum. Each member's suit was fitted with biometric monitors, O-regulators, and redundant comms. The snow crunch under the vehicle's treads was the only sound, punctuated occasionally by the distant roar of shifting ice ridges. As we ascended the final ridge to the station, the aurora above twisted, shimmering in unnatural patterns, reflecting off the metal dish array. Preliminary scans indicated structural integrity intact, environmental controls functional, and radar equipment operational. Yet a subtle anomaly registered immediately. The station's energy consumption appeared inconsistent with its operational load. Fluctuations were minor, almost imperceptible, but enough to trigger an internal alert in Lieutenant Lin's signal processing console. No one spoke of it aloud. Instead, we established our routine: perimeter check, sensor calibration, atmospheric sampling. Shadows stretched long under portable lights, sometimes appearing outside the field of vision only to vanish when inspected. A hum that had accompanied the anomaly logs seemed to follow us now inside the station, resonating through walls and floors in a low, pulsing rhythm. Colonel Ristoff's final words echoed in our comms as we approached the main entrance. Remember, observe, report, survive. What you encounter may not be hostile, but it is beyond control and beyond understanding. I remember thinking, as I crossed the threshold, we had trained for cold, isolation, and operational failure. We had not trained for the station itself noticing us. The path from Forward Arctic Command to Polar Watch 7 was deceptively short on the map, roughly 12 kilometers of permafrost, ice ridges, and glacial crevasses. In reality, it was a gauntlet of fatigue, frostbite potential, and a psychological strain that no simulator could replicate. We departed under a low cloud ceiling, visibility limited to less than 20 meters, with winds gusting unpredictably at over 120 kilometers per hour. Every movement required coordination. Every step demanded awareness of crevasse edges, hidden ice, and the limitations of our gear. Our transport, the Aurora 7 hovercraft, hummed with a mechanical precision that initially felt reassuring. The interior lights cast sterile white beams, illuminating the faces of my team, pale against the fatigue and cold. Biometric monitors flashed green. Oxygen levels remained nominal, but almost immediately, subtle anomalies began. Shadows inside the cabin flickered against walls without consistent light sources, and the hum of the engines occasionally warped, seeming to resonate in frequencies that rattled teeth and ribs. Private Jansen first vocalized it. Did anyone else hear that? His voice cracked over comms, though sensors detected nothing beyond the hovercraft's machinery. Lynn adjusted her console, tracing the signal fluctuations. It's irregular, not mechanical, not atmospheric. Just present. I noted it but maintained focus on navigation. The ridge ahead narrowed, with ice formations that could easily destabilize the craft. The hovercraft shuddered against an unexpected wind shear. Specialist Harrow gripped the console, muttering calculations for wind load and counterthrust. For a moment, the anomaly seemed to synchronize with natural turbulence, flickers of shadow along the hull. Reflections in the frost-coated windows, elongated and morphing shapes that appeared human for a heartbeat, then stretched into something else entirely. Corporal Markov ran atmospheric scans continuously. Temperature and oxygen levels were stable, yet barometric readings fluctuated in patterns inconsistent with meteorology. Leaves' murmurs grew quiet, almost reverent. "It's sensing us," he said, voice low. None of us laughed. None of us moved to contradict him. The final approach to Polar Watch 7 was a descent over a ridge where the snowpack shifted beneath the hovercraft, creating a surreal, almost liquid texture. The aurora above bent in unnatural arcs, casting green and violet reflections across the ice. Shadows outside elongated, sometimes converging with our own silhouettes. The hum had grown into a rhythmic pulse, vibrating in the hull, in our bones, in our minds. By the time we reached the station's entrance, 20 minutes had elapsed according to our chronometers, but the logs showed over 12 hours had been registered by satellite sensors. Time itself seemed to fracture. We disembarked carefully, EVA suits fully sealed, weapons at the ready. Each footprint we left on the snow appeared briefly, then vanished as if swallowed by the air. The wind carried a metallic tang, sharp and invasive, and the pulse, the low, omnipresent thrum resonated against the station's steel walls. No one spoke as we approached the main hatch. Not yet. There was a shared understanding. What awaited inside was not just an Arctic facility, it was a threshold. And crossing it meant leaving the familiar rules of the natural world behind. Crossing the threshold of Polar Watch 7 was deceptively mundane. The hatch hissed open under hydraulic pressure, the release sound echoing unnaturally in the empty corridor beyond. Fluorescent lamps flickered sporadically, casting brief pale washes over steel walls. A faint metallic temp clung to the recycled air, sharper than our external sensors had indicated. The entry corridor was narrow, barely 2 meters wide, lined with consoles and redundant environmental panels. Sensor readings were nominal: temperature, oxygen, structural integrity, all within operational limits. Yet something felt wrong. The hum we detected outside had intensified, now forming a subsonic pulse that resonated against rib cages and helmet visors. Lieutenant Lin led the communications sweep, scanning for electronic interference. Her console registered bursts of data that did not correlate with known devices, faint transmissions, regular energy spikes, and fleeting images in static bursts resembling humanoid shapes. Finger sows briefly, fingers hovering over the console. "They're observing us," she whispered, almost involuntarily.
Ow.
The team advanced cautiously. Private Jansen's boots clanged against grated floors, each strike echoing with unnatural delay, as if the corridor itself stretched in time. Specialist Harrow inspected the facility's infrastructure, conduits, dampers, and pressure regulators. Readings were internally consistent, yet some of the measurements contradicted previous logs. Panels flickered to life independently, displaying indecipherable symbols that glowed briefly before vanishing. Corporal Markov conducted atmospheric sweeps. Air composition was stable, yet minor fluctuations suggested energy fields interacting with our molecular environment. He noted that oxygen partial pressures subtly varied depending on which section of the corridor we occupied, as if the facility itself was breathing. Sergeant Major Thorne took point, his veteran instincts sharpening. He paused mid-step, hand raised. "Something's wrong with the geometry here," he murmured. "These corridors, they're not lining up with the schematics." Indeed, the maps we carried no longer aligned with observed distances. Their junctions appeared and disappeared. Stairwells led to identical corridors we had just passed. I logged these anomalies meticulously. My notes read like normal operational reports, yet internally I recognized the impossibility. Physics was not failing incrementally, it was bending selectively. Shadows elongated independently, angles seemed inconsistent, and reflections in polished panels suggested more occupants than present. The team remained disciplined. Adiklev Markov recorded biometric data. Heart rates elevated, respiration irregular. Some team members reported brief vertigo. Others felt pressure in the chest, a subtle suffocation that could not be attributed to oxygen levels. We established checkpoints, repeated scans, and cross-referenced equipment with schematics. Yet with each step deeper, the station's layout refused categorization. It was during our initial sweep of the central operations room that we first observed an anomaly unmistakable in its sentience. The console displayed a sequence of symbols that rearranged themselves when we blinked or looked away. The glyphs pulsed in rhythm with the low hum, a silent signal synchronized with the station itself. I noted the first real fear. This was no longer a facility to operate. It was an organism, and we were intruders in its domain. After the initial entry, we attempted to normalize operations. Our immediate priorities were standard: verify sensor arrays, check environmental controls, and catalog anomalies. On paper, it was routine. In practice, the station resisted routine. Lieutenant Lin and I set up signal relays in the central operations room. Equipment functioned nominally, yet occasional bursts of static carried patterns that felt purposeful. Names, perhaps, whispered through the intercom, distorted but distinct. Corvan Leave. Harrow. Each syllable lingered in our helmets long after the sound should have dissipated. Private Jansen performed perimeter sweeps, documenting floor layouts and structural anomalies. He returned at intervals, reporting that some doors appeared in areas previously surveyed as solid walls. He claimed to glimpse pale figures in peripheral vision, always disappearing when confronted. I logged his reports meticulously, annotating them as possible hypothermia-induced hallucinations, though privately, I doubted that explanation. Specialist Harrow inspected generator cores and power conduits. Fluctuations persisted, minor but persistent, hinting at energy consumption inconsistent with load. He joked about the station running on something else, but his eyes followed shadows that did not align with our lamps. Corporal Markov monitored atmospheric conditions. Small deviations in barometric pressure and oxygen partial pressures persisted, with periodic spikes unaccounted for in engineering logs. The air sometimes carried faint metallic tangs, stronger in the eastern sector. Leaves speculated about residual energy fields, but every sensor contradicted the theoretical framework he relied upon. Sergeant Major Thorne established a patrol rotation, emphasizing redundancy. Movement patterns, however, quickly defied expectation. Corridors seemed to elongate, junctions shifted, and distance between checkpoints varied with perception. Even our maps became unreliable. A simple return to a prior location felt like a maze of ever-changing geometry. Despite these anomalies, the team attempted normal operations, calibrating radar arrays, logging environmental readings, and maintaining communications. Our discipline held, but a subtle anxiety took root. Equipment that had functioned flawlessly for years began to display irregularities. Shadows behaved independently, light flickered against unbroken walls, and the faint hum beneath our boots persisted, a rhythm almost alive. Even in the relative stillness, we felt observed. The station itself seemed aware, anticipating our movements, adjusting to our presence. Every procedure, every protocol, suddenly felt fragile. Normal operations became a veneer over creeping uncertainty, and a quiet dread began settling across the team. Unspoken, but universally acknowledged. The first true disturbance occurred on the third operational cycle. It was subtle, almost innocuous, but it shattered the fragile confidence we had built in the station's reliability. Lieutenant Lin was monitoring the CUM relay when the anomaly appeared, a faint signal spike. Brief and erratic, displaying patterns that did not correspond to any known frequency. She leaned closer, adjusting filters. In the console flashed a sequence of symbols, glowing glyphs, reminiscent of archaic scripts, rearranging themselves in impossible permutations. For a moment, the symbols seemed to reflect the shape of our team members, mirrored across the screen. Private Jansen reported seeing footprints in Sector C just outside the eastern observation bay, despite the floor having been scrubbed and sealed only an hour prior. The prints were human-like but elongated, the proportions subtly wrong, as though the walker had stepped through both space and time unevenly. Specialist Harrow traced the anomaly to an electrical panel, finding no faults but noticing the panel's light flicker in synchronization with the hum that permeated the station. The hum had taken on a low, vocalized quality, almost a chant, rhythmically rising and falling like a lullaby recited backwards. Corporal Markov's readings registered a temporary surge in energy fields, localized and inexplicable. Oxygen levels remained nominal, but pressure sensors spiked for a few seconds, pressing the air into our lungs with subtle, unnatural force. Leave noted that the anomaly seemed to probe, affecting our physiology, without leaving injuries, something almost sentient. Sergeant Major Thorne's patrol log indicated that the corridor lengths shifted, as if the station itself were breathing. A junction previously measured at 12 meters now stretched to nearly 18, before snapping back when remeasured. We confirmed this through repeated checks. I documented the event meticulously, annotating it as a minor anomaly in official reports. Yet privately, I recognized the pattern. The station was experimenting, learning, or communicating in ways that defied all operational understanding. Shadows now had weight, light had intention, and sound carried shapes that did not belong. By the end of the cycle, the team was silent. The minor disturbance was officially logged. Operational parameters returned nominal, but an undercurrent of tension persisted. This was no ordinary facility. Something lived within its walls, and it had noticed us. Within 24 hours of the first disturbance, the station's behavior escalated. Subtle anomalies became persistent. The hum, once background, had grown into a pulsing presence felt in bone, chest, and helmet alike. Shadows now moved independently of light sources, stretching along walls, sometimes vanishing into angles that did not exist. Private Jansen returned from a sweep, reporting that footprints appeared in patterns that no human could produce. Some loops led into walls. Others seemed to fold back upon themselves, converging with footprints we had left ours earlier. He showed them to me, pointing at depressions in the snow-like floor coating, that shifted even as we watched. I noted the pattern. The station was not only shifting geometry, it was recording us, imitating our movement, anticipating it. Lieutenant Lin's console displayed anomalies with increasing frequency. Data spikes formed rhythmic pulses, sometimes in sync with the shadows. Occasionally, the glyphs she observed would reconfigure into what appeared to be familiar shapes, faces, figures, or distorted silhouettes of our own team. She whispered that the symbols seemed to watch her hands, rearranging themselves when she looked away. Specialist Harrow began murmuring to himself, tracing the flickering lights with a sense of purpose beyond calculation. Equipment flickered in a bizarre sequence, panels cycling on and off, monitors displaying brief glimpses of other rooms, corridors, or figures that vanished when approached. Harrow muttered about echoes in the steel, about the station itself breathing. Corporal Markov's atmospheric readings intensified the unease. Pressure variations now synchronized with the hum, pulses pressing air in and out of helmets as though the station exhaled in time with our own respiration. Leave observed minor vertigo in each team member brief. Disorienting lapses where perception of floor, wall, and ceiling became unreliable. Sergeant Major Thorne confirmed what we all felt. The corridors no longer behaved logically. Stairwells led to areas previously marked as dead ends. Junctions multiplied or disappeared. Even our mapping equipment failed, looping over identical coordinates while the physical environment contradicted them. I documented the escalation with increasing dread. Each minor anomaly, the flicker of a shadow, a displaced footprint, the subtle warping of geometry was no longer an isolated incident. It was a pattern, a deliberate, patient interaction. The station was alive in a way that defied biology or engineering, learning and adapting to us. By the end of the cycle, the pulse of the hum had synchronized with the team's heartbeat. Shadows crawled along walls and ceilings with a silent patience. We were no longer visitors. We were participants. And whatever this was, it was aware. The first direct encounter occurred during a sweep of the eastern wing, an area containing secondary radar arrays and storage for environmental sensors. The anomaly patterns we had been tracking intensified, converging toward the sector like a tide. Lieutenant Lin's console flared with erratic signals, the glyphs multiplying and pulsing violently. "It's here," she said, voice barely audible over the hum that now resonated as an almost deliberate rhythm. The lights flickered violently, casting elongated shadows that seemed to move independent of all known physics. Private Jansen froze, pointing toward a corner of the storage bay. A figure, or what we initially perceived as a figure, stood there. It was humanoid in shape, but impossibly tall, with elongated limbs that bent at unnatural angles. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, reflecting the flickering fluorescent lights in unsettling patterns. Eyes, if they could be called that, shimmered with a spectrum of colors that defied visible light. The entity moved, and the corridor geometry warped as it stepped. Walls stretched to accommodate its stride. Shadows flickered in impossible directions. Specialist Harrow raised his weapon, voice trembling. "I don't know if it's live," he muttered. Corporal Markov's readings spiked uncontrollably. Energy fields, atmospheric pressure, oxygen partial pressures fluctuated violently. The hum had become a chant, pulsing through our helmets and bones in synchronization with the entity's movements. Sergeant Major Thorne advanced cautiously, attempting to establish visual confirmation. The figure seemed aware of us in an uncanny way, responding to our positions before we moved. Its limbs bent backward over its shoulders, fingers stretching like elongated tendrils. The air itself seemed to thicken. Each breath required effort beyond the limits of our oxygen monitors. Lieutenant Lin attempted to communicate, transmitting standard frequencies. The entity responded not vocally, but by reorganizing the glyphs on her console. Words, perhaps, or patterns resembling language, but not any language we had ever known. It imitated speech without sound, shaping reality around us to mimic comprehension. I noted the first visceral fear. This was not hostile in the conventional sense, but it was aware, deliberate, and patient. It did not attack immediately, merely observed, testing, adjusting. Shadows began to detach, following its movements independently, creeping toward us, stretching across the floor and walls. Specialist Harrow froze, eyes locked on the figure. When he exhaled, frost formed in patterns that mirrored the entity's limbs on the cold floor. Private Jansen attempted movement, but his legs felt weighted, as if the station itself resisted our attempts to advance. I recorded each observation meticulously. This entity was a convergence of space, energy, and perception, an intelligence beyond biology, interacting with our environment as if it were malleable clay. For the first time, I realized the anomalies were not failures of equipment, they were manifestations of this consciousness. We retreated carefully, every step measured. Even as we withdrew, the entity's form lingered in the periphery, bending angles, stretching corridors, and etching itself into the fabric of the station. By the time we regrouped in the central operations room, every team member was aware. Polar Watch 7 was no longer merely a facility. It was a vessel for something ancient, patient, and intelligent. The first encounter left no marks on paper or skin, but it left a shadow in our minds, permanent and unyielding. The hours following the first direct encounter were marked by a shift too profound for conventional explanation. The anomalies that had been subtle, frustrating, and persistent now began interacting with us directly. The station, if we could still call it, that was no longer just a collection of steel and sensors. It was a force reshaping perception, bodies, and minds. Private Jansen was the first to manifest a physical change. During a corridor sweep, his shadow detached and moved independently, sliding along walls and ceilings while his body remained rooted to the floor. He screamed when the shadow reached toward him, but there was no contact, no visible mechanism. By the next cycle, his gait had subtly altered, limbs stretched slightly. Disproportionately, his silhouette warped in a way that mirrored the entity we had encountered. He muttered about being followed by himself and refused to enter certain sectors. Lieutenant Lin's connection with the station deepened unnaturally. Her console became an extension of perception. Glyphs now pulsed in synchronization with her heartbeat. Frequencies she alone could detect filled her helmet with whispers that were not her own. She began answering the signals automatically, her voice blending with static, almost as though she had become a conduit. Attempts to pull her away resulted in faint tremors in the station's walls, as if it resisted separation. Specialist Harrow's obsession with the anomaly reached a grotesque extreme. While repairing a flickering panel, he reported that the steel itself called to him. The panel's lights danced over his skin, etching faint, luminous symbols. Hours later, a section of his flesh appeared slightly translucent, revealing faintly glowing patterns beneath the epidermis. Harrow remained functional, but increasingly unpredictable, calculating with precision, while occasionally speaking in unknown dialects, tracing walls with trembling hands. Corporal Markov's medical expertise began to fracture. Readings from his instruments suggested that some team members had biological anomalies that defied physics. Jansen's elongated limbs, Harrow's subcutaneous luminescence, even Lin's neural activity flickering across uncharted electromagnetic bands. Leave attempted to rationalize, attributing readings to hallucinations, radiation, or unrecorded energy phenomena, but the anomalies persisted. His own pulse sometimes registered as multiple overlapping heartbeats, each slightly out of sync with reality. Sergeant Major Thorne's memory began to fray. He would recall performing patrols that had never occurred, repeating checks for corridors that did not exist. Attempts to cross-reference his logs with mine revealed empty files, corrupted timestamps, or data overwritten with false readings. Yet Thorne retained his operational composure, instinctively guiding the team, even as he could not trust his own recollections. I myself experienced temporal dissonance. Chronometers diverged. Seconds became minutes, and hours passed without linear progression. Footsteps echoed before they occurred, shadows preceded their sources, and the hum now resonated in our minds, shaping thoughts and perception. I documented everything with meticulous precision, knowing that official reports would sanitize these events, but the truth remained. By the fifth operational cycle, the station had actively reshaped us. Each anomaly had targeted vulnerabilities. Bodies altered subtly, cognition fractured, perception manipulated. Fear was no longer abstract. It was tangible, physically present, shaping the environment around us. The entity we had encountered was patient, and it's methodical. Silent manipulations ensured that each of us was no longer merely observing the station, we were components in its operation. Even as we moved, even as we attempted normal protocol, it became apparent Polar Watch 7 did not merely house anomalies. It curated them, engineered interactions, and ensured the irreversible alteration of every operative within its walls. The line between the team and the station blurred, and in that blur, I realized survival was no longer the objective. Understanding might be impossible, resistance futile. By the sixth operational cycle, Polar Watch 7 had ceased to resemble a conventional facility. Corridors twisted, expanded, and duplicated, disorienting our internal maps. The hum, once a background pulse, now dominated perception, vibrating through bone, armor, and helmet as a persistent, sentient rhythm. Shadows had gained weight. Whispers now shaped themselves into brief, intelligible phrases, speaking our names, recounting fragments of memory, hinting at futures we could not yet see. The entity, the pale, impossibly tall figure we first observed, made its presence undeniable. It emerged from a corridor bend, accompanied by a distortion in the steel and fluorescent light. The air thickened, compressing against our suits. Lieutenant Lin's console went wild, glyphs spinning faster, forming shapes that resembled the team, our weapons, and distorted reflections of the station itself. Harrow stepped forward, hand trembling over a panel, muttering to the entity in a language that had no name. The lights reacted in kind. Streaks of luminescence traced the path of his fingers, projecting symbols onto walls that seemed to pulse with their own energy. Private Jansen's elongated shadow lunged toward the figure, then recoiled. As if recognizing a hierarchy or dominance it could not challenge, Corporal Markov's readings surged uncontrollably. Oxygen pressures fluctuated, energy fields overlapped with gravitational anomalies, and temperature readings oscillated violently. Leave noted faint neural interference across the team's helmets, as though perception itself had been hijacked. Sergeant Major Thorne advanced, attempting to secure a defensive perimeter. But the corridors responded. Doors collapsed into blank walls. Stairwells looped infinitely, and shadows coalesced into forms that mimicked our movements. For the first time, it became apparent the station was sentient, and it was negotiating. The contact exchange was subtle, yet unmistakable. The entity did not speak, strike, or flee. Instead, it orchestrated our perception. Walls shifted to contain us. Glyphs pulsed in response to heartbeats, shadows stretched to block paths, and a persistent metallic taste filled the air. Every effort to act independently resulted in automatic redirection. Weapons misaligned. Sensors reported impossibilities, and attempts to retreat were subtly hindered. Lieutenant Lin's eyes glazed over as the glyphs synchronized with her neural output. Harrow's flesh glowed briefly in response to the station's energy patterns. Jansen's elongated limbs pressed against walls impossibly far apart. Markov's instruments blinked into unreadable symbols. Thorne's memory fractured mid-command, leaving instinct alone to guide the team. I realized then the entity was not hostile, at least not in a conventional sense. It did not need to kill. It needed to interact, to reshape, to assimilate. For every anomaly, every warp of reality, was a negotiation in its language. The encounter reached its apex when the station itself seemed to pulse, walls bending. Lights synchronizing, glyphs glowing, shadows coalescing, compressing the team into a single, shared perception of dread. Our instruments failed entirely. All recorded reality converged on the entity's presence. It waited patiently, observing, testing. By the end, nothing tangible was lost, yet we were irrevocably changed. Polar Watch 7 had claimed not our lives, but our perception. And we understood viscerally that the entity's patience was infinite, and so, too, was its dominion over what we thought we controlled. We made our first coordinated attempt to leave Polar Watch 7 after the 6th operational cycle. By then, every corridor, hatch, and junction had become unpredictable. The station's geometry was no longer fixed. Stairwells twisted upon themselves, floors elongated, and shadows blocked exits with deliberate patience. The hum now pulsed in rhythm with our own hearts, compressing the air, resonating in bone, and warping perception. Sergeant Major Thorne led the team with practiced efficiency, though I could see the strain in his eyes. He relied not on maps or schematics, both had failed, but on instinct, memory, and the patterns of the anomalies. We moved as a unit, every step measured, weapons ready. Eyes scanning every flicker of light, every distorted shadow. Lieutenant Lin's console displayed erratic glyphs, glowing with pulses that synchronized with her neural activity. The symbols now formed directional customs, sort of language or logic we could not interpret consciously, but following them seemed to guide our path. Yet, the corridors themselves resisted. Junctions stretched, walls shifted, and floors tilted at angles that defied physics. Private Jansen's altered limbs scraped against walls and ceiling alike, making traversal awkward. Specialist Harrow traced glyphs with his fingers, muttering formulas and patterns that made no conventional sense. Corporal Markov monitored atmospheric and energy anomalies, noting that pressure and oxygen readings fluctuated violently, compressing our chest with an invisible weight. Leve's calculations suggested temporal distortions. What felt like minutes passing could correspond to our Zor, days outside the station. The first surface sighting of the exit hatch was encouraging, but reaching it proved impossible. Each time we neared, the corridor leading there elongated or folded back, and shadows multiplied, blocking lines of sight. The aurora outside bent strangely, as if echoing the station's internal geometry. Finally, we crossed the threshold. The station released us, but not without consequence. Chronometers showed only 20 minutes had passed on the surface, yet internal logs indicated 14 hours underground. The external environment felt wrong. The snow reflected more colors than possible. The metallic temps of the air lingered, and shadows fell in impossible directions, stretching against natural light. We moved away cautiously, knowing the anomaly had not abandoned us. Every sound, footsteps, wind, vehicle engines, resonated with subtle distortions. The station remained behind, yet its influence lingered, pressing upon perception and memory. Our survival was incomplete. The Arctic itself seemed altered, familiar yet alien. I logged our exit meticulously, aware that even this documentation could be altered or suppressed. The station, the entity, and the anomalies had reshaped not only the environment, but our understanding of it. What we escaped physically, we carried psychologically and existentially. Even outside, the hum persisted faintly in bone and mind. The Arctic was no longer simply a frozen expanse, it was a threshold. A vessel, and we had passed through it, irrevocably changed. Emerging from Polar Watch 7, it became apparent that our survival came at a cost far beyond physical injury. The anomalies had imprinted upon each of us in ways that were permanent, defying biology, physics, and reason. Private Jansen was the most visibly altered. His right arm had been cleanly severed at the elbow, yet there was no blood, no pain, no signs of trauma. The limb had seemingly been absorbed into another dimension, leaving behind an empty socket that felt alien yet functional in perception. He moved carefully, eyes wide, muttering about the part of him that remains in the station. Lieutenant Lin's voice had changed. Communication through her helmet emitted fragmented electronic tones, static-laced modulation that persisted even when attempting normal speech. Attempts to override her comms were futile. The anomaly was integrated, a new conduit for the station's persistent pulse. Specialist Harrow's medical and engineering knowledge became fragmented, scattered across incomprehensible timelines. He could recall detailed anatomical structures, but now intertwined with alien physiology, possible machines, and civilizations lost to time. He documented these in hastily scribbled notes, only to find them incomprehensible upon rereading. Corporal Markov's cognition and memory remained largely intact, but he reported subtle distortions in perception. could sense energy fields, temporal anomalies, and atmospheric fluctuations far beyond human capacity, yet could not translate these into actionable understanding. Sergeant Major Thorne retained operational discipline, yet memory of the past several hours or perhaps days was missing entirely. When asked about specific patrols or decisions, he recounted only an empty facility, oblivious to the events that had altered us all. His composure remained, but his mind had been partially overwritten. I myself bore the subtler weight, senses hypertuned, perception fragmented, chronometers diverging from reality. Every sound, shadow, and flicker carried dual meanings, one inconceivably ancient. I documented each alteration, meticulously aware that any official record would sanitize or erase these changes. Together, we were survivors, but survivors in name only. Each alteration was irreversible, unique, and unexplainable. We carried the station within us, imprinted on mind and body, reminders that the Arctic facility did not simply house anomalies it curated, assimilated, and transformed those who entered its domain. The team was intact in body, yet fractured in essence. We had escaped physically, but the station's reach extended far beyond walls, corridors, or time itself. Upon extraction, we were met with sterile efficiency. Base officers operated with unsettling calm, masks of professional detachment concealing nothing, yet communicating everything.
Ow.
There was no relief in their demeanor, only a clinical observation of anomalies they had already catalogued and perhaps orchestrated. The debriefing room was minimalist. White walls, harsh fluorescent lighting, and a single digital recorder. Officers instructed us to recount events, emphasizing operational protocol, environmental conditions, and standard anomalies. Officially, nothing extraordinary had occurred. Unofficially, every statement we made seemed to twist, warp, and fade into the sanitized narrative they required. Lieutenant Lin attempted to relay the glyph interactions and her neurological synchronization with the entity. Her words came out distorted, filtered through static that was not her own. Officers nodded, recorded, and then disregarded the details entirely, labeling them as sensor, artifact, or cognitive misperception. Specialist Harrow described the subcutaneous luminescence and temporal fragmentation of his knowledge. His account was transcribed into neutral technical language, stripped of context, and filed under standard equipment malfunction reports. Even the physical anomalies, Jansen's missing limb, altered physiologies, were catalogued clinically, as if procedural anomalies rather than evidence of a sentient phenomenon. Corporal Markov's extensive readings of energy fields, temporal distortions, and atmospheric anomalies were treated as minor sensor errors, inconsistencies to be corrected. His notes, though detailed, were rewritten in official logs to suggest nominal station operation. Sergeant Major Thorne's memory lapses went unremarked upon, as if expected. The officers showed no curiosity, only methodical confirmation that personnel had returned, equipment had been restored, and the station remained secure. I recorded these interactions meticulously, noting the dissonance between truth and documentation. Every attempt to convey the full scope of what occurred was met with subtle resistance, audio distortion, question rephrasing, and an automatic shift toward acceptable responses. Files were labeled classified, archived, yet subsequent requests revealed non-existence. The extraction was efficient, the base calm, the debriefing sterile, everything had been sanitized. Each team member was reassigned in ways aligning with their altered states. Lin continued in communications, now more conduit than analyst. Harrow in engineering, obsessively tracing patterns beyond human comprehension. Jansen in reconnaissance, trained for limb-specific tactics. Markov in environmental observation. Thorne in leadership, operational yet amnesiac of key events. Even as we left the base, the Arctic station's influence lingered. Every observation, every record, and every memory was under suppression. Reality itself had been rewritten. We had survived physically, yet psychologically, existentially, the station maintained dominion over us. I am aware that these notes, my testimony, are unlikely to survive unaltered. The official record will describe a successful mission, minor sensor anomalies, and fully intact personnel. The truth, our transformation, the sentient station, the entity's patient manipulation exists only in this account. The line between observation and assimilation is thin. We are no longer merely personnel, we are vessels of Polar Watch 7. I sit in my quarters, pen in hand, attempting to finalize this testimony. The room is quieter, so it seems, but nothing is as it appears. Shadows flicker independently of the ceiling lights, stretching across walls, pooling in corners that should not exist. Occasionally, an extra limb appears in the dark, bending in impossible angles before disappearing when I blink. My electronics behave unpredictably. The monitor on my desk flashes containment logs and countdowns in languages I do not recognize, glyphs pulsing faintly in time with the hum that has never left me. The phone emits static that whispers names I have not heard in years, yet it feels intimately familiar. Even my watch displays the wrong time, tracking moments that do not correspond to the physical world outside. Outside, footsteps echo heavily in the hallway. Too heavy for a single human, too deliberate for normality. They pause, then continue moving independently of my perception, yet synchronized with the pulse in my chest. I have no doubt that the station's influence persists beyond its frozen walls. It follows, observes, waits. I glance at my reflection in the window. For an instant, it moves differently, liminally, as though a portion of myself remains trapped in the corridors of Polar Watch 7. Every detail, every anomaly I experienced, lingers within me, shaping perception, bending cognition, extending the entity's domain into my mind. The hum pulses once more, and I feel the weight of infinite patience. The entity does not act in haste, does not need to destroy us directly. Time is on its side. Reality is malleable. We are fragile, and it waits, knowing that humanity's own actions, hubris, and desire for control will suffice. I write these final words not to warn, nor to record a factual report. It is already too late for that, but to bear witness. The entity is patient. It does not need to destroy us. It can wait for us to finish destroying ourselves. Even in my small enclosed quarters, I am aware that observation persists. Electronics, reflections, they are all conduits. Nothing is truly private. Nothing is truly safe. I close my notebook. The flickering light casts an alien symbol across the page. I feel it watching, counting, learning. I understand, finally, that escape is an illusion. The Arctic, the station, the entity they endure. And we are nothing but fragments in their patient gaze.